In this video, I'm going to teach you about waveforms, what they are and how to interpret them, as well as talking about how waveforms relate to frequency, understanding frequency and harmonics. And then we're going to take a look at some ways to analyze audio so that we can train our ear by using our eye, which can be super helpful. So let's take a look. We'll tackle waveform first. And so a waveform can be considered to be a visual representation of a sound over time. And so, for example, in front of us here, I've got a snare drum sample, and it's a certain period of time long, and you can see all of these massive fluctuations in the waveform until the sound ceases. Okay, so this is like a set of instructions in a way that are being sent to a speaker, and the speaker will move and vibrate to recreate the sound. But if we take a step back from that, we can consider, okay, we've got a person with a snare drum and a drumstick and a microphone on that. That microphone's going back to an interface. The person takes the snare drum at the drumstick, hits the snare drum vibrates and pressurizes the air. The microphone has a diaphragm inside of it with a magnet, and as the diaphragm vibrates, the magnet on it starts to generate an electrical signal, which then goes down the cable into your interface, into your microphone preamp. And then at some point in that process, it is converted from an analog electrical signal into a digital signal, which then goes into our computer. And so the process of turning that electrical signal into a digital signal is called digital to analog conversion or analog to digital conversion. And this step involves something called sampling the audio. So as you've got this electrical signal coming in, and it's moving all over the place relative to the sound that's being created, we're taking snapshots of that electrical signal as it comes, and we're mapping it in terms of its amplitude and position in time. And we'll talk about amplitude a little bit in a moment. But if we look at the sample rate that I'm using in Ableton, I'm using 48,000 samples, right? And so what that means is that in a 1 second period of time, as the signal's coming in, we're taking 48,000 snapshots of it, where we're mapping exactly what is happening with that electrical signal's fluctuation at that given time. And so here we've got the snare drum. Let's take a bit of a closer look at it. You can see that there's a line that runs through the middle here. And as the signal gets weaker and weaker, it just turns into a flat line. And so what that flat line is, or what it represents, is zero amplitude. And we call it the baseline. And you can see that the waveform makes positive and negative movements around that baseline. And the distance from the top to the bottom is the overall amplitude of the signal, or the strength of the signal, right? And so that's what we are interpreting when that diaphragm on the microphone is turning the vibration into an electrical signal. So these fluctuations are representative of that electrical signal fluctuating, and then we're capturing it, taking snapshots of it, turning it into digital form, and here we are with it inside of our computer, and we can press play, and it makes noise. And that noise should be somewhat representative of the real sound that happened in that room, but of course there's many things that will subtly change the tonality of the sound, but as we get better and better microphones and better and better preamps, equipment, etc., we get better and better at capturing that audio. Now, moving along into the world of synthesizers, we're able to make pure tones with sine waves. Okay, so a sine wave is a type of waveform, and we'll have a look at that next. So let's take a look at a sine wave. I've got a synth in front of me here called Vital, and I'm going to use that to play back a sine wave to you. And the sine wave is going to be in the note of C3. So I'll go ahead and press play. If I put it up 12 semitones, so send it up an octave, send it up another 12, or even go down negative 12 semitones, or 24. That is the sound of a sine wave. And a sine wave is a pure tone. So we're getting like a pure frequency out of this. And we'll talk about frequency in just a moment. What I'll do is I'll turn this from a signal that the synthesizer is generating to an audio signal, right? So I'll just freeze and flatten, and now we've got a waveform with an actual piece of saved audio. And I can make this bigger, and we can zoom in on it, and you can see all these squiggly lines. So we've still got this line running through the middle that's the bass line, and we can see that the amplitude begins changing at the start here. So we have a movement in the positive direction, and then we're going into negative, positive, negative, etc., etc., and that keeps cycling over and over again. And if we look at these points here, the point at which the waveform crosses this center line, this is called the 0 point crossing. And what that means is that at that particular moment in time right there, there is zero amplitude to the signal, right? And if we take if I highlight a selection from there to there, what we're highlighting here is the positive and the negative movement of that waveform. And this is what's referred to as one cycle. So we've captured one full cycle or one oscillation of this sine wave. And so if we have a sine wave that in 1 second of time, there are 10 cycles, we would say that that is 10 hertz. So the frequency value of that sine wave would be 10 hertz, because hertz is frequency, and that's the number of cycles in a second. So if we had 20 cycles of this particular sine wave in a 1 second period of time, it would be 20 hertz, so on and so forth. And as we get higher and higher in frequency, we get higher and higher in pitch. As I played to you before when I was in the synthesizer and I pitched it up, it gets higher pitched. But there's still sine waves that are playing that are just playing much, much quicker. And we can play them at a speed all the way up to, some people can hear all the way up to 20,000 hertz or 20 kilohertz. And so, to recap, this is the waveform. It's effectively giving us instructions that we can send out to a pair of speakers. If we convert this into an electrical signal, the speaker will start moving and generating that particular tone that our brain will then interpret. Now, something to mention as well is this sounds like esoteric, but there's no such thing as sound. I think a lot of people like to say this for like shock value. So effectively what happens, right, when we hit that snare, and the air is vibrating, what's effectively happening is the air becomes pressurized, and our inner ear has a little membrane that then vibrates, just like the diaphragm inside of a microphone. It vibrates, and then our brain interprets that signal and converts it into what we perceive as sound. So yeah, sound doesn't really exist as like a thing, but pressurization in the air interpreted by our brain generates sound. And so that's an interesting way to think about it. So these are like it's like the DNA of a piece of audio. And so let's talk a little bit more about frequency. This is a website that shows the frequency values of different musical notes, which is pretty cool. And this is using A4 at 440 hertz. So this is not a lesson on music theory, but basically what that means is if we come down here to A4 is 440 hertz, and then all of these other notes are relative to that in the mathematical way that musical notes are sort of generated and formed. And so we had a sine wave playing, and it was in the octave of C4. So if we come here, we can see that C4 is supposed to be 261 hertz. So we're able to go back into Ableton and take a look at that and see if it correlates. So I have got what's called a spectrum analyzer plugin, and I have put this plugin on this audio channel. And if I play audio on this channel, it's going to come into this plugin, and the plugin is going to give me a readout on the spectrum analyzer, showing me the frequencies that exist in this waveform over time. And down here, we've got the frequency values from 20 hertz up to 20,000 kilohertz, or 20,000 hertz or 20 kilohertz. And then here we've got volume. So let's go ahead and press play. Let's turn my speakers down a bit. Okie dokie. So we're seeing this green boy here. And if we put our cursor bang on it, just here it's telling us where our cursor is. So you can see it says it is C4, or somewhere around the 200 and something or other range. Okay, so this is the visual representation of the frequency content that exists inside of this waveform. So that's very interesting, but it's quite boring in a sense because there's only just one tone. And in nature, when do you ever really hear one tone? You don't. It's a man-made thing to be able to hear that, which is cool in a way. But we're going to take a look at what this snare drum looks like. Let's do that. So we'll click the snare drum, we'll open the spectrum analyzer on that snare drum, and we'll do this and do that, and then do this, and then do that, and do that. Let's have a listen. Okay, so this is more interesting. There's more going on. There's way more frequencies. And so we can see that there's some really low frequencies down here. Probably stuff that we can't hear, because imagine that is negative 72 decibels down low. This is the loudest part of the sound. It's around negative 22 dB. And then we've got this part, which looks like it's probably the fundamental of this particular snare drum, and it's probably what's giving the snare drum some tonality. So if the drummer, sorry, that's probably really annoying, me talking over top of a snare drum constantly going off. So if we imagine this drummer tuning his drums, he may have tuned to a particular note. And so we can see, yeah, it's probably tuned to F sharp or something like that, right? And we can get the particular hertz value, and we can get the volume of it using the spectrum analyzer. So it's a pretty cool tool. So we can take a look at some other frequency content and other waveforms as well. So we've looked at sine waves, but the fundamental building blocks for sound design in synthesizers are sine waves, triangle waves, saw waves, and square waves. So we'll take a look at those other waveforms as well. I'll go ahead and render out some audio, and we'll take a look at it. Cool, so I've rendered out a whole bunch of audio. We've got the sine wave here, and we'll just re-familiarize ourselves with that. I have rendered it in the note of C5. So if we press play, and we put our cursor as best we can sort of in the middle of that, we've got C5, which is about 530 hertz. Okay, so let's take a look at a triangle wave. I've rendered all of the different waves at the same note, so they're all at the note of C5. And we'll zoom in a bit more on this triangle wave. I'll just close this for now. We'll zoom in a bit more on this triangle wave, and we'll select one cycle of the triangle. So we've got the zero crossing point here. So if we select from there, we've got the positive movement of that triangle wave, and then we've got the negative movement, and this would be one full cycle. So positive, negative, back to the baseline, from the baseline. Okay, so that's what a triangle wave looks like. And again, if we had this triangle wave, so it's at C5, so theoretically there should be 530 cycles of this in a 1 second period of time, which this is roughly 1 second. And I'm not going to go in there and count it, but it looks like there's quite a few cycles. And so what does that look like on a spectrum analyzer? Let's open up span. Let's make it a bit bigger as well. And we'll make sure we've got that triangle wave soloed, and we will press play. Okay, so we've got that tone at around 530, and this is what we would call the fundamental. So it's the part of the audio that's effectively giving tonality to the sound. That's what we're interpreting as the pitch of the sound, or the musical note of the sound, right? Which makes sense, and it's the loudest part of the sound. But you can see that actually there's other frequencies that exist in the sound at various different volumes. And so if we put our cursor here, we can see, okay, well, there's actually a note of G6 playing, which is at around 1.5 or 1.6 hertz. It's interesting. And then we've got another frequency that's occurring at around 2.6, and that's a note of E7. And then finally, we've just got a little bit coming through here that's around A sharp, at around 3.68 kilohertz. And I'm reading that off here, guys, just in case you don't see that there. And then they're at varying volumes as well. So we can see that the waveform's obviously jagged and that it moves out and back in a more rigid way than a sine wave, which is like rolling and smooth. This is more like sharp. And what's happening is that there's upper frequency harmonics that are being generated that we can see on the waveform and we can hear, because that sound is brighter, right? The sine wave is just kind of one single tone. The triangle wave, it's more complex. The sound is more complex. And so these are called harmonics. This is the fundamental. So this is the root note, in a sense, or like I explained, it's what we derive the notation of the sound from. And then the harmonics play at certain values above that. And it's related to maths that we're not going to get into here, but we just want to know that they're harmonics and they make the sound richer. And they're at varying volumes, so they're not as loud as the main fundamental. They're lower in volume. But what we can think of is, you see how we've got the sine wave and it's a singular tone, and then we play this triangle wave. The triangle wave also has that same sine wave as its fundamental. And if we went and got a synthesizer and we made another oscillator that was going to play at that volume at the note of G6 like this, and then another oscillator that was at E7, and then another oscillator that was going to be at A7, and they were all sine waves, they would sound just like this triangle wave. So what I'm going to describe to you, which for some people might be a difficult concept to start wrapping their head around, all of these are sine waves. But when they are combined together in one waveform, they make a triangle wave. Cool? So we'll talk about that again. We'll reinforce it when we move on to the saw wave now. So that's the triangle wave. Let's mute that. Here we are with the saw wave in hot pink. Nice. And if we zoom in, all right, let's do the same thing. Let's select our negative cycle into a positive cycle. Maybe we'll start from here because we're going positive and negative. And so that is the positive movement, moving rapidly back into a negative movement with some rippling oscillation back to the baseline. So that is one cycle of this sawtooth waveform. And again, because it's at the same note as C5, there'll be roughly 530 versions of this in a 1 second period of time, or cycles of this in a 1 second period of time. And so now if we have a listen to what this sounds like and looks like on the spectrum analyzer, you can see that this is a much more complex sound. Or you can hear that it's a much more complex sound. You've still got that fundamental root note or root frequency, and then you've got a bunch of additional frequencies that occur on top of it, or harmonics that occur on top of it. And if you look at the relationship between the first and second harmonic on a saw wave, you're going to see something. And this is getting a little bit back towards that maths that we said we weren't really going to talk about. But if we look at this, That is the note of C5 at about 521 hertz. If we go up here, that's the note of C6. So there is an exact 1 octave gap between the first and second harmonic in a saw wave. And then it becomes a little bit more complex than that as it continues. You see that these relationships are changing. But if we broke it all down into its fundamental pieces, like if we broke it all apart, sine wave, sine wave, sine wave, sine wave, sine wave, sine wave, these are all sine waves at varying volumes stacked together. And when they're all stacked together, they make this complex waveform. Okay? And obviously the sine waves at different frequency values. So you've got a sine wave that would be 530 or whatever this is, etc., right? So they get higher in frequency as they go, and they make a more complex waveform. But if we break it all apart, they're all individually sine waves. It's just many, many voices all together in one waveform. And then finally, the square wave. So we will select a cycle like we have been with the other ones. So here we've got our positive movement into our negative movement. So that is one cycle of this square wave. And if we take a look and a listen, we'll solo it. We'll get our scope up. This is the square wave. And it has a different tone. Obviously, all of them have a very different tone. And it's also got different frequency makeup. So you can see that when we go back to the saw waves are really densely packed up in the high frequencies. Square waves are a little bit more spaced out. And if we look at C5, here we've got G6, then we've got E7, so on and so forth. And so these are the fundamental building blocks that we use when we're designing sounds using synthesizers. And you don't really hear any of these sounds in their pure form in nature. Generally, if you have something like a guitar or a violin, the waveform that's generated when you strum, first of all, always has slight fluctuations and variations in it because the strings, you're hitting them at different places and maybe with different force. So it's always slightly different. And the way that it resonates in the body of the guitar, it's never quite the same. You can get it close, but with a digital synthesizer, you can get it basically recreating exactly the same sound over and over again. So these tones are very different to what you find in nature. Nature has much richer harmonics on sounds, generally speaking, and there isn't really one that's better than the other, I guess. Depends on what your perspective on it all is. But hopefully you learned heaps about all of this. Maybe all of this was new to you, maybe only a little bit was, but I hope that you took something valuable out of it. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions, ask them in the comments below, and I will see you again very soon in another video.